I'm reading from chapter 19 of my book, It's Not a Boy. This is the start of a new chapter called the Boulder. And the boulder stops you doing lots of things and gets in the way. It was my last year at Ringham Primary School. I was going to be in Mr. Bantam's class. I had to do well and I was quite scared. It was an important year because I had to pass my scholarship, which was a test to see how clever I was. If I passed, I would get into the top class at my next school in Ripsey. My mum and dad would be proud of me at last, even though I wasn't the boy that they wanted. Anybody can do anything, my dad said. And I just had to believe that, and had to be brave, which I was. And remember that I was good at a lot of things. And then I'd be sure to be able to pass that test and put being clever on my list. I'd have to work hard at school and show Mr. Bantam that I was clever enough to pass my scholarship. Even now, Mum was busy on her Singer sewing machine, like the one behind me. She was making clothes for my school uniform. She'd used our Gwendy's old skirt and cut it down to fit me. And then she folded the material into pleats that would hang round me. She tacked them down with big white stitches and big white knots to keep them in place. Then she pressed them in, banging it hard on our table with her iron that had been warmed in the fire. She made me a blouse from a remnant, and I had some new socks and new navy blue knickers from a shop in Hull. I looked very smart indeed. When my big day came after the summer holidays were over, I dressed excitedly and I put on my skirt with Mum's tacking stitches still in. And then at the last minute, just before I went up High Lane to catch the bus, Mum pulled each knot in turn and long white snaking threads came out, and my neat knife-like pleats concertinaed round my legs. They were tight as I walked, and I could feel them. Mr. Bantam would surely be pleased. I went confidently into my new classroom, but Mr. Bantam was not pleased. In fact, he didn't seem to notice me at all. He didn't bother whether I looked smart or not. All he was bothered about was, did I know my times tables? I sat down, folding my pleats carefully under me. 8 6s, 7 4s, 9 7s. You can see what he was doing. He was choosing the very hard timetables, and he was balancing around the classroom like the Bantam cock I had seen at Sunnyside. Of course, I knew most of my tables by now, but when he was there and he was shouting them all out at different places, I got nervous and couldn't remember a thing. I looked longingly at Miss McBride's class. Oh, sorry, it was Mrs. Gray's class now. I could see them through the wooden screen that had glass windows. I stared at all the young kids coming in and how she smiled kindly. She would have noticed my pleated skirt and said how nice I looked. I just knew that she would. But of course I couldn't go back there because, well, first of all, I was worried about her being married and how she felt now about what she'd seen in Mr. Gray's trousers. But also, you can't go back. and I knew that. Mr. Bantam moved on to spelling, still hopping around the classroom, and my pleats were hanging loosely, going limp. When we were in Mrs. Gray's class, we didn't do our spellings out loud. We did them writing, and you had a rubber, so if they didn't look right, you could just rub it out. Not now. Mr. Bantam said we had to do it in our heads. I was really very scared, and he was going round the class shouting out spellings, and my turn was getting nearer and nearer, and Brenda was next, and she was next to me, so it would be me soon. I had to do something. I put my sweaty hand up in the air and asked to go to the lavatory. Mum said we had to call it the lavatory now and not the lavvy. We were in Mr. Bantam's class after all. Of course he had to let me go. I couldn't sit there and he would be scared I did something in my pants, so I went outside. But I didn't go to our lavatories across the playground. I just breathed in that fresh air, that lovely fresh air that had got me out of doing my spellings. And I waited quite a long time until I was sure that he had finished spellings. And then I went back in. Mr. Bantam hadn't finished spellings. I'd hardly got through the door when he shouted, "How do you spell bushel?" Well, how would I know? I didn't know how to spell bushel. I'd never heard of it. But I gave it a bit of a stumbling go, and I looked down and hung my head and stared at my limp pleats between my legs. There was silence. Then Mr. Bantam shouted out his question again, and everybody was looking at me. I had to try again, but it wasn't right. But I had to get on, Mr. Bantam said, with learning spellings and my times tables. Once a week, though, we had a change. The vicar came, Mr. Robinson. And you didn't have to do anything. You just had to sit still and listen. And I watched too. Reverend Robinson was a big, fat man. Even Mam couldn't call him just plump. She didn't even call him well built, but she said that he was a substantial man of God. Well, anyway, he was huge, and he wore a big black frock with a yellow rope belt round his domed belly. When he spoke, his voice echoed all round our classroom, even louder than Mr. Bantam when he was shouting out spellings. And another difference was that when Mr. Bantam spoke to us, he looked at us, but the Reverend Robinson didn't. He stared through a classroom window with his voice going up and down in all the wrong places. And then he said a long, long prayer, and then he walked out with his head held high. I don't suppose he even knew we'd been there. He had his mind on higher things, said Mam, because he was a man of God. And that made me think that maybe when he looked through our window, he was looking straight at heaven. Mostly Reverend Robinson preached about things I couldn't understand, and I didn't even bother to listen. But one day he told us, or rather he told heaven, about a bushel. And he was saying what it was, and that made me look up and take interest. Here was my bushel again, and I even knew how to spell it now. A bushel is a bowl to measure corn, and it's 8 gallons that make 1 bushel, he said. I knew I could remember that because 8 was my lucky number. I'd been born on the 8th of May. I might get a question on a bushel in my scholarship. Anyway, he was not talking about that. He was telling us that we must not hide our light under a bushel. No man, when he hath lighted a candle, putteth it in a secret place, neither under a bushel, but on a candlestick. Preached. Your light is what you are good at, he added, still staring out of the window, of course. Well, I had loads of things on my what I'm good at list, so I was very pleased. I was filled with hope that Mr. Bantam would be impressed. But then, suddenly, I had a bit of bad news.